This video is going to look at atypical gender development. So remember, by atypical we mean not normal. So this is when gender development takes a different turn. So it might be looking at things like gender dysphoria, gender identity disorder. On your specification, you've got to know about gender identity disorder. You've got to know the biological and social explanations for gender identity disorder. So it could be a question on biological or social, or an essay looking at both. So we're going to go through both. We're going to go through the AO1 for biological, then the AO3 for the biological, then the AO1 for social, then the AO3 for social. So what is GID, or gender identity disorder? Well, it's where someone experiences a bit of a mismatch between their biological sex and the sex they feel they are. So it might be born male, but I feel like a female. I'm born female, but I feel like a male. That would be gender identity disorder. It's where they identify with the opposite sex rather than one that they were identified at birth. So they always identify with the opposite sex. And it is recognised as a psychological disorder. The DSM-5 is sort of a checklist categories of different mental disorders, and this is classified in there as a separate psychological disorder. And these people often identify themselves as transgender, and may also opt to go for gender reassignment surgery. So it brings their genitals and their sex in line with their gender identity. There's two main theories you've got to know: biological and the social psychological explanations. Firstly then, we're going to go through the AO1 for the biological theory. And within the biological explanation, we've got two main approaches. We've got the brain sex theory, and also that gender identity is caused by genetic factors. So we're going to look at both of these. The brain sex theory states that gender identity disorder is caused when your brain structure is incompatible with a person's biological sex. And by that I mean a transsexual, for example, their brain doesn't match the sex they were assigned at birth. So you may have been born female, but you've got a male brain. And what this theory focuses on are those parts of the brain that are different in men and women. If you remember a previous video, or the very first video we looked at in gender, we looked at how the different connections in males and females' brains differ. That's part of this theory. The male brain and the female brain are programmed and wired differently. And it might be that gender identity disorder is caused by having different brain structures, the brain structure for the other sex. So who did a study on this? And he found that one part of the brain, called the BSTC, is 40% larger in males than females. And we assume that this is fully developed by the age of 5. So males have a larger BSTC than females. However, when they conducted their study, they did post-mortems on 6 male to female transgender individuals. And what they found was that the BSTC in these males was a similar size to that in females. Okay? And it shows that males might have a brain similar to females when they have gender identity disorder. Also, the number of neurons in the BSTC showed sex-reversed identity patterns. So the number of neurons they had was far more similar to a female brain than a male brain. So remember, these are males. They were born male, but the size of their BSTC and the number of neurons in the BSTC was very similar to that of a female, which strongly shows that there must be a biological reason for someone developing gender identity disorder. Maybe it is all linked to the pathways and neurons in the brain. We've also got genetic factors, and it has been suggested that there is a transsexual gene, that there is one gene that we have that causes people to develop gender identity disorder, and it's a genetic variation in this gene that causes it. And Hare came up with this theory and conducted a study on it to try and show the influence of this particular gene. He had 112 male to female transsexuals, and what he did was he analysed their genetics. And he found that majorities of these male to female transsexuals actually had longer versions of an androgen receptor gene. So remember, androgens are testosterone. So they had a longer version of an androgen receptor gene. And what this meant was that testosterone had a reduced effect on them. So when they were in the womb, these males, testosterone didn't have as much effect because of this gene. So their prenatal development was affected. They wouldn't have got a masculinized brain. So because of that, that's maybe why they developed gender identity disorder. They've got a masculinized brain, and that may well be the reason why gender identity disorder occurred later on in life. We also have a twin study by Hayland, who looked at 23 monozygotic and 21 dizygotic twins. And out of these twins, out of each pair, one of the twins was diagnosed with gender identity disorder. And then we look at concordance rates. So 39% of the monozygotic twins were concordant with gender identity disorder, whereas none of the dizygotic twins were. So 39% of monozygotic twins, if their other twin had it, would have developed the disorder, whereas it didn't make a difference for dizygotic twins. If their twin had it, there was no chance of them developing it. This indicates the role of genetics in gender identity disorder. It's also been suggested that there might be environmental effects, and this is a nice little one if you get time to slip into your essay. And this is all to do with pollution. So pesticides over crops contain DDT, and some of you who have used insect repellents will also see the words DDT written on the front of them. And DDT contains estrogen, and it's been suggested that if males are prenatally exposed to high levels of estrogen and DDT, then it could cause gender identity disorder. It could cause a mismatch between their genetic sex and their hormones. Okay, so this could be potentially one reason. Prenatally, if a male is exposed to high levels of DDT and estrogen, it might explain the reasoning for maybe a more feminized brain. Right, we're now going to look at the AO3 for the biological explanation. There is supporting evidence for the brain structure causing gender identity disorder, and Rametti conducted a study on female to male transsexuals, and he looked at their brains and scanned their brains before they underwent hormone therapy. And what he found was the white matter in the brain of female to male transsexuals was more similar to their desired gender. So their brains and the white matter in their brain was more similar to that of a male than a female. Even though they were biologically female, their brains and the structure of their brain was more similar to that of a male. But there's also contradictory evidence for this. Chung conducted a study where he looked at the volume of the BSTC in males and females, and that it didn't develop until adulthood. So the size of the BSTC didn't develop until adulthood, these changes. Remember we said male BSTCs are 40% larger, but Chung said this doesn't occur till adulthood. But transsexuals report that they feel gender identity disorder from a much, much younger age. You'll see some people start 2, 3, 4 years of age saying that they're feeling gender identity disorder. And it suggests that biological factors alone can't cause gender identity disorder. Right, of course it's a reductionist theory, it's biological, it says genes, hormones cause gender identity disorder. It ignores all the social psychological factors we're about to go and look at. So you can use your reductionist theory paragraph in here. There's also the idea that this is very socially sensitive research. And by this we mean there are social consequences to this research being conducted. Are people better off with or without it? So if a biological cause is found, maybe people will become more accepting of gender identity disorder. Maybe they'll say, right, people are born with that, that's the way they are, we can understand that. However, a negative of it is, once we start doing fecal scanning, then if you found out that there is a gene and your baby had the gene for gender identity disorder, it's most likely going to result in an increase in the number of abortions, because it is a very difficult thing to deal with. So people might take the option of aborting instead. So this is essentially socially sensitive research. Are we better with or without it? A further issue with the biological approach is that it's all based on correlational research. So we can't be sure of a direct link between biology and gender identity disorder. For example, do changes in a brain structure cause GID, or does GID cause changes in the brain structure? We can't reliably establish cause and effect from these studies. We're now going to look at the AO1 for the social psychological explanation. Within the social psychological explanation, we've got different theories, okay? And they all focus on how a child is socialized and brought up their environment. So the ones we're going to look at are whether it's a mental illness, mother-son relationships, and father-daughter relationships. So they're the three things we're going to have a look at. So there is a study to support it being a mental illness. Coe conducted a study of a young boy and found that he developed GID as a defense mechanism as a reaction to his mother, who was suffering from depression after having an abortion. So the mother had her abortion, and the child developed GID as a defense mechanism to help him deal with his mother's depression. And what Coe said was really important was it occurred before the age of 3, which is a very sensitive age for gender development. And that this trauma most likely led to a cross-dressing fantasy as a means to deal with it. Maybe it made him feel closer with his mother, maybe it's his way of dealing with it, but this cross-dressing fantasy eventually developed into GID. Mother-son relationships have also been put as an explanation for gender identity disorder. Scholar conducted a study and found that GID resulted from distorted parental attitudes. And he conducted clinical interviews with GID individuals. By clinical interviews, we just mean in a controlled clinical setting. And he found that those children displayed overly close mother-son relationships. And he claimed that that really close relationship between a mother and son led to them identifying as a female. Okay, led to greater female identification and therefore confused their identity. So if you're close, really, really close to your mum, overly close, then that potentially could be one thing that leads to gender identity disorder. Father-daughter relationships have also been shown to cause GID as well. So Zucker conducted a study on female to male transsexuals and found that females identify as males because of their parental rejection in childhood. So a young girl rejected by her father, and they unconsciously think that if they become male, they might gain the acceptance of their father. Okay, so that's another theory looking at why gender identity develops. So we're now going to have a look at the AO3 for the social psychological explanation. And there is a study to contradict the idea that it's a mental illness. Cole looked at 435 individuals, far more than the Coe study we looked at earlier. And he found there was no psychological conditions or differences between the control group of normal people and the GID group. So no psychological differences whatsoever. So it suggests that it's not down to mental illness. And because this is a far greater sample size, it shows far more valid results than Coates' earlier study. But overall, it points towards GID not being a mental illness, and mental illness not contributing to GID. There's also a study to support mother-son relationships as an explanation for gender identity disorder. Tucker conducted a study on 115 boys with GID and found that 64% of them were diagnosed with separation anxiety. So this therefore points to some sort or some kind of disorganized attachment, disordered attachment to the mother. So if they've got separation anxiety disorder, then it shows some overly close relationship with the mother, which later developed into gender identity disorder. However, you want to bring in a methodological issue, use this. It only explains male to female transsexuals. We can't generalize the results of females because it was only conducted on boys. And again, of course, you can say it's a reductionist theory. This ignores the brain sex theory, it ignores the role of genes, use that reductionist paragraph that we've learned, and put it in at the end of your essay. It is a reductionist theory. It only focuses on mother-son, father-daughter, and mental illness as the explanations for GID.